Welcome back to the Games Make a Difference Symposium. Before we start our first panel discussion, I'd like to introduce our moderator. James O'Hagan is a global leader in connecting and promoting esports in education. He's had a role in starting and growing esports teams in 2 large urban school districts. He actively promotes esports as being a medium to something more for students beyond the games. His podcast, the Academy of Esports, delves into topics surrounding esports and education and connecting into powerful ideas to increase student agency, motivation, and college and career pathways. James is a proud Boilermaker. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Education from Purdue University in 1999 and is a former member of the All-American Marching Band.
Woo. And big bass drum captain.
He's also a doctoral candidate in Northern Illinois University in the field of instructional technology. Currently, James is the Director of Digital and Virtual Learning for the Racine Unified School District. On a personal note, James was the first person I met in the esports community. Over the past few years, he's been a mentor and has become a real friend to me. So I want to give a personal thank you to James for everything that you've done for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Our first panel today is entitled Games Will Make a Difference by Making People Feel They Belong. Your panelists are virtually Dr. Samantha Blackmon, Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Composition at Purdue University and co-founder of the award-winning feminist game studies blog and podcast, Not Your Mama's Gamer. Also, we have Phan, Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Voice of Intercollegiate Esports and Assistant Operations Manager for AnyKey. Joining us in person, we have Kevin Fair, the CEO and founder of iPlay Games. And we also have Dr. Roberto Gallardo, Director of the Purdue Center for Regional Development. Ladies and gentlemen, your moderator, James O'Hagan.
Thank you, Chris. And we're going to try something a little different. So I've got, oh, perfect. Look at that. Look at it. It's crystal clear.
These guys, right.
This is fantastic. So hello, Hillary. Hello, Dr. Blackmon, Dr. Gallardo, Kevin. Thank you all for being here today. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming to West Lafayette. I graduated here in 1999. This place has completely changed. The building we are standing in right now was not this in 1999. But I will say that I know that Purdue has really made efforts to talk about how people belong on campus. When I came here in 1993 as a freshman student, I came from San Mateo, California, knowing nobody. I purposely came to the Midwest to get away from to get lost. And when you step onto a campus this size, it's very easy to get lost. And I didn't realize how, for some kids, that could be a very isolating thing. But the thing that I stepped into when I stepped onto campus was the Purdue All-American Marching Band, which after my freshman year became my family. But my sophomore year is what kept me here on campus. I failed Physics 152. So if any students here have taken Physics 152, you know that that class is the weeding class for that. I failed my calculus class. I got a D- in my major, which at the time was chemistry, and I got an A in band. And it was truly the band that kept me here. It was the community that kept me engaged. So it was the thing that helped me to realize that I belong here at Purdue. And I see that gaming, it serves a lot of that purpose as well, too, for a lot of our students. At least I see it in the high school level that I'm at right now. But for these wonderful people here, we have such a diverse panel of people. We have people speaking from different lenses. And the first question, I already gave all our panelists the first question, but I'm going to direct the first question actually to Dr. Blackmon. I'm going to let Dr. Blackmon lead this off here today. So Dr. Blackmon, through the lens of games, making people feel they belong, 5 years from now, what are your predictions about gaming and or digital spaces? Or how do you envision your own professional or personal life changing because of that?
That's an amazing question. So 5 years. 5 years feels both like a really long time and a very short period of time. So I think that even in the last year or so, we've seen some real advances in DE&I spaces, and I want to focus on accessibility because accessibility is something that is important to me both personally and professionally. Um, and I would say, if I had to think about where games as a field is in 5 years in terms of accessibility, I think that we're going to make some amazing strides. Um, I have thought a lot about not only accessibility in terms of things like hardware, but also things like software. And I'll give an example. Um, Recently, I've been playing Horizon Forbidden West, right, and things that I didn't know I needed, but I actually did. Um, One of the things, anyway, is the tinnitus setting in Horizon Forbidden West. That game, if you've seen it or played it, has lots of kind of mechanical whirring and kind of the sound of metal grating. And if you have tinnitus, which I do, um, it can exacerbate it, right? So it can bring about a bout of tinnitus, even if you're not experiencing it in that moment for some folks. But just having someone having thought about that, right, in a game in particular, so that it makes that game more accessible to folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to play it without experiencing some kind of pain or about a tinnitus. So I think because there's been so much attention and so many folks, so many like amazing smart folks who are working in the field of accessibility, who are working with games now. I think in 5 years, we're going to have games that are a whole lot more accessible um, to folks who can't play certain games now or games at all.
Well, and I know too, when we talk about accessibility, that we're not just talking about um, access to the game itself or being able to play. Dr. Gallardo, a lot of your work has been in just accessibility, especially in some of our rural communities or in some of our urban areas where access to a game, being able to just be able to play in some of these digital spaces is difficult. How do you see the potential of the world changing in the next 5 years as far as how we belong in these spaces?
Sure. So I think that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity right now with a massive investment from the federal government and several states on the broadband infrastructure space. There is a digital divide between urban and rural, but there is also a digital divide that includes urban and rural. It's a very complicated topic, but I think in the next 5 years, if we do things right, I think that we're going to be able to move the needle and allow rural residents that tend to have access to more expensive, slower networks, that they can afford them and they're faster, so they can then be involved in gaming. And I was just impressed by the previous speaker of all the educational implications that gaming has, right? It's speaking of leveling the playing field. So I think that in the next 5 years, we have an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime to really move the needle in that respect.
And in speaking of that opportunity, I know that you and I had a conversation before the panel here today, where we looked at how many dollars there are right now set aside just for something like this. I think you said there's about $350 billion set aside to connect our country, as we found through COVID that some of these, the COVID situation exacerbated the digital divide in all of our communities. Again, a lot of people think this is just an urban issue, but this is a rural issue as well, too, especially. And I believe the number was what? To make everything right, we're looking at $200 billion to connect everything. So there's barriers still to all this connectivity. And to bring it back to Dr. Blackmon's point, I think when you talked about the tinnitus that you suffer from, and having a game that recognizes some of the issues of accessibility just from a physical standpoint. What I love about the concept that you brought up, Dr. Blackmon, is that people are now building these things with you in mind. They're thinking of other people beyond just a person. They're thinking about the people who are playing these games. Kevin, you've done some amazing work in the city of Chicago. You work with Chicago Public Park District. COVID for you became a whole different opportunity to connect people and make them feel they belong. How did you with I Play Games start to connect kids in the city of Chicago to make them feel that they belong?
Well, beyond kids belonging, I'm a guy who runs game tournaments, and I'm on a panel with people who have PhDs.
But you belong, Kevin. But you belong.
I already belong and have been included. And no, honestly, I think you bring up a great point, especially when you talk about how the quarantine and COVID and those types of things really allowed us to kind of pivot or to branch out in a lot of different ways. And what you'll learn is that a lot of kids who enjoy video games, especially in particular urban areas, do not necessarily have the internet capacity to really kind of participate on the right kind of level, right? And so not only do they not have the capacity, but you're also educating mom and dad on how, like, hey, Wi-Fi is not great. It's awesome for surfing the web, but not too great for playing video games. And here's the interesting thing. That is a STEM lesson in itself, right? You imagine something we take for granted, Wi-Fi, really is a networking tool that we use and it just happens. And most kids have been born in a world that's completely connected, but they've never been taught about the different grades of connectivity, right? So here I am, I get to say, do you know why you're lagging in 2K or Call of Duty right now? And I get to tell them that, hey, your ping is not as good. And so they start to learn about a lot of these different terms. While guess what? I get to meet them in a space where they're incredibly already familiar. I get to meet them where they're at when we play video games in that way. And so I think it's really cool to be someone who gets to be a role model for really just doing something that they love, but at the same time, take some of those lessons on how, good gaming or gaming that's quality can help teach kids about, hey, so not only you're going to get better at games, but you're going to also understand something about technology and connectivity in this experience.
Now, Hillary Phan, who, Kevin's like, I can't believe I'm sitting here on a panel with doctors. Actually, you all should be like, I can't believe I'm on a panel with Hillary Phan, because Hillary is, she's being modest. She's holding up no, don't say this. But Hillary is, I guess you could say, one of these people who has grown up and grown the industry, especially at the collegiate level. She is a trailblazer coming from the University of California at Irvine. She works now with Voice. She works now with AnyKey. Hillary, in the time that you have been a part of this, have you seen an evolution in how people define how they belong? Because it used to be like, oh, you got to play League of Legends, you have to do these things. But what are some of the things that were done at UCI to make people feel like they belonged and they were part of the gaming community?
Yeah, I think it all comes back to treating people as people and then prioritizing their unique needs and desires. So I spent a lot of time engaged with students directly at UCI, a lot of one-on-one check-ins, a lot of trying to manage the internships and the scholarship teams to empower and support the students themselves. Those were my primary goals. And that's how you create a sense of belonging, by saying, like, I care about you and I want you to belong, and I'm willing to make these changes to make sure you feel that way. So that was a lot of my focus, just like learning a lot about the student experience and then being able to invent and create and modify different programs for them. And what we're seeing, like, broadly is more people paying attention to that sense of belonging, right? And so that's where I hope to see the industry go in the next few years, like a continuation of that, of celebrating different voices, of creating those spaces for them, of telling these unique stories. We've had like a really, we've been in a stranglehold of the same types of games, the same type of voices, the same stories being told over and over. And now we're starting to see some blossoming of creativity, of innovation, of new stories. Like, just for a quick example, in the movie industry, we've got Encanto and we've got Turning Red, and now we're getting like a new generation of stories being told. And I'm hoping to see more of that like pattern of us like telling our stories as opposed to the ones that we've been told over and over.
Yeah, Disney seems to have a good handle on stories that they've evolved, where it used to be the Cinderellas and the Snow Whites, which were they were in the common, I forget the public domain, where they took those stories. Now we're seeing some new stories. Dr. Blackmon, you probably, listening to Hillary, had some being an English professor here at Purdue University, you probably heard some things there, especially when it comes to stories. You actually teach a class on campus around gaming and the stories within games, is my understanding. Was there anything that resonated you when a student comes in here and you're taking a class in video game stories, I guess, if you will, and how they feel they belong when they come into your class, or the environment that creates?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there were two things that kind of resonated. Not only with what Hillary just said, but just what everyone said so far, just in this first round of questioning. But yes, on stories, definitely, right? And this more prevalent shift, shall we say, but towards like telling other kinds of stories, like non-traditional stories, or stories that are not kind of the same stories we've heard over and over again. And when I talk to students about it, we look at different kinds of stories and the ways that stories get retold. And also the ways that we get more diverse stories. For example, we were talking about like platformers and the kinds of stories that we usually get in platformers. Like there's Mario who has to save Peach over and over again. Or even when we get other kinds of platformers that are not necessarily Nintendo platformers, we still get a lot of stories where a character who is coded as female has to be saved by the hero who's coded as male. But going outside of that and looking at like new games that are coming out and telling diverse stories, like the recent platformer Raji, which tells a different kind of story where you have a young Indian girl who goes to save her brother, but it's that same platformer genre. And rather than having piranha plants and chain chomps and our more traditional kind of platformery bosses that we have to deal with, there are bosses that are pulled from Indian culture, Indian history, right? That we have to deal with, and in having to deal with them in specific ways and the different mechanics that get used, we learn more about those stories. We learn more about those traditions, right? So there's all kinds of stuff that is like constantly going on. And the field is evolving, and I think that that's super important. And the second thing I want to do, I'm going to try to be quick because I talk a lot, but the second thing I wanted to touch upon is in terms of thinking about access and thinking about what happens when people get access. And I cheated and I went back and I listened to all the podcast episodes with all the panelists because I wanted to know what people were saying. But I know, Hillary, you were talking specifically about like the questions that we deal with when we start thinking about, do we want to have like all female like esports like leagues? Do we want to have tournaments that are all kind of female, that are all female contestants? And I think about what happens when folks get access. This is something that I've thought about and started like writing about 20 years ago when I was thinking about computers in the classroom, is what happens when folks who don't usually have access get access, and how we meet them at that point, right? So there's two kinds of access in this situation: material access and then historical access, right? Because people have different histories with access and they're still catching up to do even once they have that material access. So starting to think about things like whether or not we need female esports leagues, whether or not we need esports leagues that meet people like where they are culturally, economically, et cetera, and looking at, for example, how a lot of HBCUs are starting their own esports like leagues as well, and competing against other HBCUs because there are other kind of cultural and economic and material issues that have to be thought about in all of these situations. So yeah, I'm gonna stop though.
Well, and I think it's important that you bring up that that idea of, for a lot of our families, at least in the community in which I work in Racine, the pandemic was the first time that wired internet access was brought into the house. And as Kevin kind of talked about, a little bit alluded to, is that they have the Wi-Fi, but they think that they can do everything on it when maybe it's good for some very basic services. Dr. Gallardo, do you have any stories or asides on the transformative nature of when communities are finally connected into the internet? Again, in our pre-interview, we talked about internet as a public utility, and with the wish that internet would be a public utility, but there's barriers to it. But what has been the transformative nature of helping people belong in some of these communities where there finally is quality connection?
Well, before we go there, I just want to share that a study just came out that linked lack of broadband to higher COVID deaths, controlled by multiple factors. The only variable that persisted was lack of broadband access. So now we have tangible evidence of what we knew was going on during the crisis. It's just when I work with rural communities, some of them come to me and tell me, I already have fiber. What now? So there is a mental kind of mindset change that needs to happen from a community economic development perspective. But from an inclusion piece, for example, now rural communities have been left out of the 20th century economic development model, which was industry attraction, right? They were successful at a time, and then they started to plummet in the 90s and early 2000s. And now suddenly remote work pops up as something like, oh, this rural community says I can be part of it. And not necessarily because you're going to bring in these urban liberal folks to live into a rural community, but rather because the rural folks, if they're trained and if they have the connection, can be part of this remote work community. So that's just one example. There's educational examples, there's healthcare examples. I think that use of internet has some downsides, as some research has pointed out, but I think it has a tremendous potential to feel communities that have been traditionally left out be part of, right? Feel like they're a part of that.
And Kevin, I know in your work, when you started with Chicago Park District, again, City of Chicago is incredibly diverse. Some areas of the city feel left out sometimes. Some are very well blessed, depending on who they're connected to because of city politics. But what has the Park District done now that you've made this first foray into gaming? At the start of the pandemic, there was a lovely, fantastic story written about you. I believe it was in the Chicago Tribune about your efforts. Yeah, right. Kind of a big paper. But now the Chicago Park District, again, Mayor Lori Lightfoot is using trauma-informed care at the city level, looking at how trauma has impacted the city of Chicago. But the Park District has taken new initiative as well, too, to help kids and community to connect. What are some of the things that are happening, at least with gaming at the Park District?
Well, what's really interesting is that, my company's background very specifically was for-profit companies and live events. We were doing things like Comic-Cons, we were doing New York Comic-Con. Our group would also put on internal, competitions and whatnot for really anybody of any background. And then what I had to applaud the Park District for doing was really reaching out to us with the idea of saying, hey, this is something that we don't understand. And I'm gonna be honest, as a minority business owner, a lot of times we get looked over for those opportunities because institutions generally like to work with institutions. That's just a part of life. It's a part of business. But I have to give them credit for really kind of reaching out to someone that I think they understood, had an idea of building something organic as far as community goes. And so they reached out saying, hey, we don't know anything about esports. And we've seen you for essentially at this point, a decade or a dozen years at this point, create 13, yeah. 13 years, really kind of create community with no money. We didn't market these things on television. We didn't own any billboards or anything like that. And so I think at the very core of it, they reached out to a small minority-owned business to kind of, spearhead this humongous project that we did virtually at first. I think the article kind of very much pinpoints what we did virtually in I think that was December of 2020. And I thought what was really great about that was that it gave us the opportunity to kind of grow the project. So guess what? A lot of times park districts have, hey, we got this out for our kids. Well, guess what? We had 100% participation. Every kid that signed up got to play that day virtually. Now, granted, I think between myself and my team, we probably might have been the only groups to really kind of handle kids from every part of Chicago and kind of say, hey, so you're going to play this person here and you're going to play this person here. Here's how you get connected on, this platform. And what they've done since then is that they've grown out what they call teen centers. They generally have inside of each park, they have something called a teen center. And those things were really meant for like hanging out or, kind of watching television. And what they did was they took our advice and made sure that the internet was what they prioritized. They said, hey, we want this part to play against that part. And they took our advice on that. But then on top of that, they made sure that on the north side, they built some teen centers with game centers in it. On the west side, they built teen centers with game centers in it. On the south side, they built teen centers with game centers in it. And all of them have the same kind of internet. Now, guess what? I'm in a super, interesting space because my mom works at the Park District. She teaches art and she makes jewelry. And so guess what? When they were like, hey, Miss Fair, can you do this on the internet? She was like, yeah, that's a good one. And so I've experienced where there's a park that is a have-not when it comes to internet, and then watch the transformation kind of happen in a way that was incredibly intentional. I'll give them credit. Adrian Loza and company were incredibly intentional about spreading those opportunities to everyone who played games, who only had access to maybe 2K, on up to people who have access to play things on a high-end PC. And so I like to think we were an extension of that. We kind of helped inspire this idea that everybody should be brought to the table on this. And it's done really great. I've had a lot of fun going to different sites, providing kids with gaming experiences and opportunities. We did an event live at a park where we also had a professional football player who came in virtually to talk to the students at the same time. That pro football player is a gamer. So he got to talk to everybody at all of the different parks while we were interconnected and playing and kind of broadcasting from one of the parks that's a little more centrally located in the city. So no, I give tons of props to Mayor Lightfoot and the Park District and their efforts for that. So.
And to just to make sure that people are aware, we are taking questions over Zoom, but also if anybody here has questions for any of our panelists, those are going to be, we're going to give you that opportunity as well. In fact, we do have a question we're going to bring up, but I also want to let everybody know that if you follow on Twitter, it's at Games Make a Diff, 2 Fs. You can also find links to the conversations that these people had with me. So I realize that sometimes when we do a panel discussion, there's some great things that can be said and some things can get missed, but I wanted to make sure that we gave some time to each of our panelists here. So each of them has their own podcast episode through the Academy of Esports. If you look it up online, you should be able to find their podcast episodes. Chris, there's a question from online that we wanted to bring in, correct?
Yep, we got our first question for the panel. A common challenge on campuses, both high school and collegiate, is not seeing the same representation in real life gaming spaces as you find online. Many clubs are predominantly male. What are some ways to effectively create an invitation to play that results in a more diverse student gamer walking in the door?
Hillary, is that a softball question for you?
Right,
or?
tee it up.
I mean, I guess. The first thing I would recommend is to realize that these efforts go beyond just representation, right? It's a huge part, but we need to do more than just like place a diverse group of people on a panel, right? We need to do, what's your commitment to it, right? Like, what's your long-term plan to engage these people, make them feel safe, and maintain that relationship, right? It's not just a one-time thing. It's evolving your relationship with these groups of people and adapting to their needs and communicating with them all the time. So easy recommendations. Language is super important. People underestimate the power of language so often, but oftentimes when you're in a position of trying to seek safety, you will rely a lot on these signs, these signals, right? So even something as simple as including your pronouns, that is a positive signal. It's not a guarantee by any means that people will be like, oh yeah, this space is safe for queer folks. No, but it is a positive signal and you need to build those positive signals. What you're building is trust. They need to trust that when they walk into your door, they will not be harassed. They will not have a terrible time. You don't want people walking into your space hoping for the best is a neutral experience, right? You want them to have a positive experience. So it's really about intentionally creating those sorts of opportunities, creating like we kind of briefly talked about women-focused events, trans-focused events. You need to explicitly name them and say, you are safe here, you belong here, we want you here, we organize something here for you, and then continue that, not just a one-time event, but a long-term relationship, consistent efforts over time, things like that.
Any other panelists wish to tackle a question or extend on Hillary's thoughts? Dr. Blackmon?
I'd say extend because Hillary nails it, right? But thinking about like ways that we can help build communities that demonstrate to folks that they are welcome, that they belong, because just in thinking about the word belonging, right, and using that in this panel, in the panel title, I also think about making people aware of the fact that not all gamers, not all esports athletes are male. So having different focused events, like with different sets of people, but also I think a huge thing is visibility, right? And visibility and seeing oneself present in spaces like elsewhere. So being able to see more female, more trans, more queer, more Black esports athletes at events, right? Not just in media opportunities, right? But actually seeing people play, actually seeing people being able to interact with other people. And I think about, because one of the things that I study is live streaming. But being able to see people on live streaming platforms that look like you, I think is hugely important. And a lot of our platforms are guilty of not doing that. In various ways. But I think working with other folks in other kind of parts of the game community can also help, so that we have folks that are working with the same mission, shall we say.
And I want to come back to Hillary just for a second, because I think as somebody who has witnessed UCI in action, getting a chance to go on campus and not just see the participants of the League of Legends team playing, but the space was not designed as an esports I mean, yes, they have esports there, but the thing that I took away from UCI was the things that were going on outside of the facility, the fact that it was largely women run in that, not necessarily in the competitive sense, but I mean, the facility was largely women run. The social events were very diverse. Again, and I think Dr. Blackmon, you brought up the point of a common mission. Again, I know that there's a lot of people putting money into esports spaces these days. They're willing to spend millions of dollars to basically build something for 10 students, 20 students. Again, what UCI did, Hillary, again, I think you were there at the start of that whole thing. Can you talk about the creation of that space and why that area of campus? I mean, it's Irvine, California, so it's not like you have to worry about winter, but why was that space, or describe the space, and why was it chosen to be where it was?
Yeah, UCI was so lucky in a lot of senses. So I'll talk broadly. One, UCI is located like just down the street from Riot Games and Blizzard Entertainment. So already very uniquely situated there. There's a huge gaming community in our area in Southern California and in LA. So already having that community, that audience of people, they naturally, as students started to organize, there was a huge club, TAG, the Association of Gamers at UCI. It has a bunch of gaming divisions underneath it. So like the League division, the Blizzard division, stuff like that. And just a lot of students and the power of their organizing and them coming together and play. Then the students, the leadership of TAG, were able to go to the UCI admin and sort of pitch like, hey, here's our really successful club. We want to, invest more into this group. We want to, have a facility. We want to have scholarships. We want to have faculty support, things like that. And so they were able to, after lots of conversations, the arena is located, it used to be the Zot Zone, which was like our student pool hall, like couches, Xboxes in there. So it was already a sort of area meant for students to congregate and play and relax. So repurposing that space. No, it's not meant or initially designed for a PC cafe experience. We adapted to what the space already was. But trying to prioritize like a stage area where the scholarship teams can practice somewhat privately, a general play area for everyone else for events, things like just students coming in play between classes or birthday parties, things like that. And then a community corner, a space for console gamers, right? So a bunch of CRTVs, Smash songs playing on repeat. They will get stuck in their head instantly upon walking in the arena. And yeah, just really making a home base for the gamers on campus. And then in doing that, sending a signal to the students around who weren't already involved that like gaming was prioritized here, was special here. And then being able to then pour that support and involve it in outside ways. So, you know, the space is only so big. We can only fit so many people. So being able to have the huge Smash community that we already had, they played on the outside tables during events. They had like, and these are like the lunch tables usually, but we have like a CRT on each table and a lot of gamers around just playing outside. We've got the like mini stage right next to the arena where people can show streams of the games or, you know, do talks, announcements. We once had a like cosplay competition or show or whatever. That got way too complicated, way too fast. So we're not going back to that. But yeah, just being able to, again, like hold space for gamers, like it's like a mini con, right? And being able to like give them that opportunity to engage, but in a smaller community on their own campus with people they, you know, go to class with and interact with on a day-to-day basis.
I am always amazed when I saw that it was selected in a space that it was a high student traffic area. So there was a lot of students just walking by. Pew data research will tell us that 97% of boys and 83% of girls are playing video games. What's interesting, though, and I think this goes back to the sense of seeing themselves. I think Dr. Blackmon, you talked about, or it was Hillary, people seeing themselves. I talked with 3 of our hosts here who are from the hospitality management program who are helping to work this event. And I asked them if they were a gamer, and they said no. And I said, do you play any video games? And they said no. I said, come on, what's on your phone? And each one of them then proceeded to tell me about the games that they play. So while the initial response, the knee-jerk response from each of them, and it was almost instant, was no, I don't play video games. A couple of questions in is again, they didn't see themselves in it. And I think that what UCI has done is we do a really good job of telling elementary kids that play is important, because you drive by a school, you see a playground. Middle school, you may see some basketball courts outside. You may see some things to crawl on. High school, you never see any like casual play. College, what are we doing for college kids? Adults, what are we doing for ourselves when it comes for play, because play is important. But more importantly, I think, Chris, there's a question about parents. How are we engaging parents in this? Would you mind? Yeah.
Yeah, we've actually got a couple of questions.
Please. Yeah.
One is more of a topic that I think from Debbie John. What's the responsibility of the parents? What role should the parents take? I think that would be something. In fact, she said, I feel there's a massive piece of work to do in educating the parents and helping them to understand where the safe places are. I think that would be a good one. And then we do have another question. We'll just kind of hit a couple of these. Any suggestions on how to manage the kind of workload it takes for these initiatives in a way that doesn't disproportionately put the bulk of work on the very populations you're trying to support?
All right, well, let's start with I'm going to start with the parent question, because Kevin, I know, again, working with the Park District, usually I'm sure parents are very heavily involved. Please speak to that if you would.
Yeah, no. So when we initially started with the Park District, at the time, we may have been covering 3 to 4 schools. And since then, now we're at about a dozen different schools. And what's interesting is the more that we started getting the parents to understand that this is, you know, a community effort, the more we started to get really great attendance on these things. So what I always try and tell people is that you can look out your window and you'll see Pop Warner football. That kid didn't drive themselves to the field. You know what I mean? That they didn't teach themselves those plays. And so when we talk about how parents or people who are in positions to guide people and what they can do to kind of give it that type of support, I say look at traditional sports. We very much know and understand the reason why AAU athletics, especially around something like basketball, are incredibly popular right now. We understand that there's career pathways that lead to everything, in addition to becoming a pro baller, right? Well, I try and take the same approach whenever I teach something in esports and video games. I haven't won any tournaments. I've been really good at Mario Kart. Check me if we, outside, we can go ahead and work on that. But I've never won anything. But my job as an organizer has always been critically important to the industry at large, right? Understanding what it takes from a mental health aspect of esports is an incredibly important job that's only growing. That industry is growing, growing, growing. And guess what? How many parents do you run into for the very first time and say, oh yeah, I knew that the whole time? Of course, they only think you're either a professional gamer or you made the video game. And so part of the responsibility I take is trying to encourage and educate parents on, hey, so here's all the many different ways your kid can find a career in video games or through their profession, through their hobbies, create a profession. Because when I was 22, this wasn't a profession, right? People really kind of laughed at me. I left a job at a Big Four accounting firm. So you could imagine how excited my parents were when I said, I was starting video games. I left the Big Four accounting firm to do something that was relatively unheard of. But I imagine myself as the high schoolers or the middle schoolers that I work with. They want to have some type of job or career in this space, but right now it's just in their imagination. And it's only in their imagination right now because someone hasn't helped them fill the gaps. And more importantly, to support their hobby, mom and dad have got to be on the team too. Mom, dad, teacher, everyone has to say, hey, so there's incredible STEM lessons to be learned in video games. I always tell people the very first computer I fixed was my NES. When that broke, I needed to fix that computer to start playing games again. And to help fund my business for the first 5 years, I worked as a computer technician. And so I very much excelled in math and sciences because my love and hobby of video games definitely pushed me in that direction. Then when I wanted to start a business without any experience or background in that, I very much, once again, used what I knew and understood from a technology standpoint to start a business that, once again, was in my imagination, right? And, I'm very fortunate, shout outs to mom and dad, that they came around to the idea over time. But at the same time, I think that the more they were able to learn about how I became smarter in math and sciences because I enjoy video games and then supported it the same way parents support what we do in traditional sports, it became that all the more obtainable. It started to leave the imagination space.
One second, Kurt. Sorry. I'm always amazed too, working with children in the middle, elementary, and high school levels myself. When I ask the child, it's usually the first question I ask any student, rather than what classes do you need? No, I say, what video games do you play? And what's interesting, it's a very disarming question for kids to get. But what I notice when the parent is in the room and they ask the question, the child will sometimes side-eye their parent and the parent will kind of side-eye the child. So you know that there's a friction there sometimes when it comes to games and gameplay. But it's really, we have to understand that where a lot of people maybe say addiction, and I hope we're going to talk about this in our mental health panel this afternoon. When we talk about addiction, what a lot of times we're really talking about is self-determination. These kids are intrinsically motivated to play these games because they feel a sense of community, a sense of relatedness, and a sense of competency in things that they normally don't feel. They don't feel competent in school. They don't feel a sense of community necessarily in their schools or maybe even in their homes. So I think it's really important that when we talk about these, as you said, your parents kind of were like, are you kidding me? Imagine the person you love and trust the most telling you that what you are doing is a waste of time, and how crushing that can be to hear that what you are doing is a waste of time. So I want to kind of I'm going to try to work this here because I want to flip to Dr. Blackmon, but then we're going to go to a question from the audience and Kurt Melcher. Dr. Blackmon, you work with students who come to a class about video games. Do some of those kids come carrying that baggage of their parents telling them that what they were doing or playing or even coming to a class about video games going, what are we going to do? Like, do you get a sense of that when your kids come to your class? You're laughing because it's a yes.
It's a definite yes, right? And I tell my students all the time, I said, okay, so here are the texts that we need, right? At the beginning of the semester, here are the texts that we need. There's this book, this book, this book, and then you're going to need at least one video game for you to study throughout the course of the semester. And they kind of look at me and I'm like, yes, you're going to have to buy a video game for class. And I've had to do this before. And I said, if your parents don't believe you, you can have them email me, or you can CC me on an email and say, I have to buy this game for class. But another thing that I've noticed is that a lot of students come to campus and they've been forced to leave their consoles at home.
Wow.
And they're like, I have to go home this weekend and get a console because my parents wouldn't let me bring my consoles to campus. And especially like during the pandemic, I think that so there was this interesting thing, and folks who work in psychology will remember this, right? So the World Health Organization has started talking about gaming and addiction and how horrible video games were for you. Then immediately after the pandemic, they like made a 180 and they were like, video games may save us during the pandemic, because it was about community building and being able to play together in a time where we had to be physically distanced, right? And so having students like leave their consoles at home and not having that space to kind of commune, that space to build community around something that they were all super passionate about, I think has been one of the most kind of striking things for me, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of definitely this disconnect for parents when it comes to video games and sending their kids away to college, because video games, of course, can't be a serious area of study, right? So they don't want them to be distracted from the real work that they're supposed to be doing, when there are all of these other elements of gaming that definitely exist outside of just gameplay, and like skills that it helps us build, and being able to kind of build some social skills as well, which a lot of students need because they're learning to be adults. So yeah, that was a definite, yeah.
All right. And that's that's a very striking answer, especially about the console aspect. When I came here in 1993, though, my mother wouldn't let me have a TV or a radio.
Yeah.
It was like, your books. I'm like, oh boy. Kurt Melcher, question.
Question for Dr. Gallardo. In the context of like regional development, and you mentioned some of the data points, and Purdue is a research institution showing impact of COVID for rural groups. Beyond research, obviously, I think that it sounds like a big component to it. Where do you see gaming sort of being as a tool to what kind of you're charged with and playing a role with that? How does that get operationalized? Is it just research and then it's kind of like that thought mantra plays around? Is it get operationalized in a way? What role does the physical campus in your mind play? And then is there a connection from like region to global? And is that important, or is that something you think about?
All right, let's see if I want to make sure that people on the panel can hear the question too, who are coming to us remotely. So I think the question was, where does gaming fit on basically regional development of access, and then the connection into the global access?
Where does gaming play a role in technology, into like regional development potentials?
Okay, so gaming is part of regional development potential.
How does that get operationalized beyond research, or is it being thought like that? And then what role does the physical campus here play, and region to global? Okay,
and then how does Purdue's campus play into all of that?
Okay.
I think.
Right.
No, so for your first question, what we are now in the process of developing what's called regional digital inclusion plans. with a focus on workforce and economic development. So what we're trying to do is introduce the concept that gaming leads to workforce development, right? And so through that venue, we're hoping, this is too early, so I don't know how it's going to play out, but we're hoping that parents, when they hear the term workforce development with gaming, those perceptions may begin to change, right? And so, because we all know the positives of gaming and workforce development and so forth. So I think that that's a good connection to have with regional development. On the technical side of things, obviously the co-working spaces, open spaces, if we could have areas for gamers to come, the previous speaker was mentioning about, coming and forming a community and bringing them together. I think that that's a very important piece to have, because what I've seen thus far is co-working spaces do not even think of hosting a gaming event, and they could very easily, right? And again, the parents will see, what are they doing? So I think that that's kind of a double whammy on the positive side, to educate the parents that it is workforce development, right? Obviously with guardrails and all that fun stuff. Then your third question, I'm not sure I understand what you mean from regional to global. Can you?
Does that play a role in how you think about things as sort of like Purdue's mission or research, like this region enhancement? And then is there a connection to global anything, or it's like, hey, we have to start here and build this infrastructure, and then obviously that leads to different, as technology kind of connects the world?
Yeah, so, well, if I understood your question correctly, I think that obviously we are now a global world, communities are global, like it or not, even because of the internet or whatever it may be. So gaming could be a venue to then translate that term where people in a region may not see themselves as part of a global community, right? And so that could happen that way. From the Purdue side of things, I know there was a couple faculty members that were using augmented reality that are not necessarily gaming per se, but are very related to that to train. There's a lot of studies out there, I'm sure you know, that workers that come into a position learn a lot faster when they have augmented reality. And if they are gamers, they're gonna eat that up, right? They don't have to go through that learning curve. So I don't know if that answered your question, but okay.
I do like, though, that we are talking about gaming and not so much esports, because I think, especially in some of the conversations we've heard, Stephen talking about the different games that he uses to teach.
Right.
I don't think any of those were what we would call traditional AAA, competitive titles.
No.
I think it's really important, as we're talking about building these communities, that we are actually looking at it more from a gaming perspective. And if esports is a part of that, fantastic. But really, I think the bigger value in this is through the community that is built. I even spoke yesterday with a few people, and we talked about take it whether you love it or hate it. Okay, Purdue Global is here. It is an online community of students who are not here physically on campus, but imagine the possibilities of connecting with those students through Purdue Global. And now having an invitation, the invitation to campus becomes a little more real when they are much more aware of the things that are available to them beyond just where they are at their homes. Like I said, take it for what you will. I know I think I just threw a grenade in the room. I saw some of the faculty here like, anyway. All right, final question. We're down to our last question. And this one comes from one of our other panelists, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, who I'm glad there was somebody brought up addiction earlier and the words of that. I'm sure Dr. Dunlap and Dr. Cowart will have some thoughts on that. But from Dr. Dunlap, any suggestions on how to manage the kind of workload it takes for these initiatives in a way that doesn't disproportionately put the bulk of work on the very populations you're trying to support? So again, as we're looking at the communities that are usually not represented, when you want to have those communities become represented, then the bulk of the work falls to the communities who are not represented sometimes. So how do we create the experience or the environments and make sure that, hey, we want to attract more African-American students to this. Well, we only have a few African-American students. We're going to put it on all, say there were 10 of them. Okay, well now it's like, well, I'm supposed to be the recruiter too. I'm a student here, So how do we create environments where these efforts are not disproportionately placed on the groups that we're trying to engage. Go ahead, Kevin. Sure.
So I know the doctors are going to have really good answers for this. There was a lot of multiple syllable words in that question. So I'm going to try to attack it from a layman's kind of perspective. I had a class of 13 girls, and I've never been nervous to teach any of my classes before. I was slightly nervous for that one because I realized that even though I myself fit into a minority group, I was also coming into a space where I was not particularly familiar with their lived experience. And the thing that I will say is that we need to create time and space so that we can listen more and learn more about these experiences on how you can be an ally or how you can help a group that's disenfranchised and might be disenfranchised in a way that's different from you, right? So what happens a lot of times is you'll sometimes get an initiative from a group, a company, something like that with really specific financial goals and really forget that there's people in between those goals, right? And so a lot of times you'll say, well, how do I understand a cultural issue if I don't have time to actually talk to you about it and talk to you about it from a really honest perspective, right? Not to complete, a goal for your company, but so that you as a person can really kind of connect with what that group or what those people are actually going through, right? So how do you have an effective town hall, right? Having an effective town hall that's not about feeling like one group is getting special attention over another. How do you have small conversations that are meaningful and you don't become defensive about feeling like your position of privilege or understanding something or your access to resource is necessarily an attack on you? And it's really people who are coming to the conversation very honestly, in my opinion. What I learned in that class of 13 girls was that there was more times for me to listen to what they were looking for in a gaming experience and not necessarily what the school sent me there for, which was to be like, do like an esports thingy for them. And what I ended up finding out was that, I would be in these really interesting situations where the girls were laughing, they were giggling, and it wasn't because they were laughing at me. It's because the time that we spent playing video games was social time for them. They laughed about what they had experienced in school that obviously I wasn't privy to. And then there were some things that I didn't experience as a 15-year-old girl that I had to learn through those experiences. Like, oh, this is funny to them. And times where my switch brain as a football player, but we're not winning, guys. Why are we laughing? We're not winning. And so it was like, well, wait a second. I learned to listen and learn that it wasn't about winning. And it was really about learning things that they found, interesting or exciting about school. And through that, video game time became something different than here's how you win, here's the cheat code to getting good. It became more about a social experience of learning what this one young lady went through today that her peers were either there to help her for, they could understand. And sometimes they would ask me, well, how do you deal with this as an adult? And I would say, well, guess what? I may have personally not experienced that, your lived experience, but here's how I'm watching other, mature adults kind of go through that scenario. And we ended up growing this class. I consistently had them for an entire year where I was like, man, I don't know if these girls are going to like me. They may drop out, that type of thing. And instead, we had a really successful class because I think we all came to it open to learning. And most importantly, me. I came, open to learning about things that I didn't find myself having to experience in the same way. And so I think the cool thing is that the differences that we have can really be an opportunity for all of us to do something great with, right? We may be able to find out how much more we can do successfully together through our differences. And I think if we, like I said, come to conversations honestly trying to learn those things, we give ourselves a better opportunity.
I really feel, Kevin, I know you made comment about all these doctors on this panel, but I think you're closer to finishing your dissertation than I am. Anybody else want to pick up where Kevin left off or add to or extend the conversation?
I'll go ahead. So I think my two main points here are to get more people involved. We see a lot of like this one DEI person at an organization or whatever. And while that is helpful to have someone, keeping things on track or making it their responsibility, it really needs to be a collective effort, right? It needs to have everybody on board from the leadership to the employees, stuff like that. Like the way we, don't put the work on one person is to literally not do that, right? Like get everybody to pitch in however they can, get everybody educated, so that it's not one person sending off all the reminders, hey, don't say that word in the office, stuff like that. And then the other thing is to take initiative, to learn about these things and act upon them before they become issues, right? It shouldn't take somebody saying like, hey, this was actually really transphobic for you to be like, we probably shouldn't allow that kind of like language or behavior here, right? Like one of the biggest challenges in DEI work, it's so much about education and persuasion and recruitment onto this. We're addressing like neglect and apathy, right? Like people who don't consider these issues in the first place or who don't care.
Yes. Yes.
So it's about literally addressing that, like getting them to like notice, like, like that quiet mediocrity where they like don't say anything, don't notice anything. Like we need to address that part. That's the part that's like allowing the status quo to persist.
And to your point too, Hillary, it's also surrounding yourself with people who will professionally, or if they're friends, politely call you out. Maybe again, being the 46-year-old white male, I try to do the best that I can. I'm not always perfect. Microaggressions, things like that. And I have a core group of friends who do say things to me like, you might want to rethink that. Okay, I got you. All right. Dr. Blackmon, you put a comment into here about being the one DEI consultant, the one DEI person, and feeling what Hillary was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we use our expertise. We try to use our expertise for good, right? So you want to be there and be in that space when people need that space, when people need that kind of expertise. But also being that one person in the room can be the kind of emotional labor that you don't want to deal with you deal with it because you need to deal with it. It has to be dealt with, but it's not something that you necessarily want to deal with all the time. So yeah, I kind of felt that in my soul when she said that. I was like, yeah, that one, but having more people in a room to have a conversation, then you also don't have that same kind of, you don't have that same kind of, I don't want to say backlash, but you don't have that same kind of load of trying to get people to understand, because there are other people who can also say, yes, let's think about this in this way as well, so that you have different perspectives that are all kind of aiming toward that same goal. And Hillary was talking about like using, speaking to people and saying, maybe we don't want to use that term. And that's like one thing. There's folks in chat, and I think if we could find a way to collect links to like people's like YouTubes and Twitches and like other like less scholarly ways that folks are putting their knowledge and their expertise out and getting people to understand, because that also addresses one of the other questions that got asked, is how do we get the kind of information that we are like the kind of information that we're generating here, the kind of scholarship, the kind of work that we're doing out to people who aren't like us. I think that's an amazing way, right? And it's one of the reasons that I do the work that I do. And I've been doing a blog, a podcast, and live streaming for 11 years now, right? Because I want to make my work accessible to those outside of the academy. I'm sorry, y'all, I know you're in the academy, but I really don't care if y'all get it, because you're going to get it either way. But if I don't make it accessible to folks outside of the academy, it's not going to create the kind of change we need to create. So that being said, I think that all of those things are important. And even like thinking about like ways that we do things outside, like in the community itself. Like in my live stream, we're not allowed, one of the phrases that, or one of the words that gets used a lot, not only in games, but outside of games, is things being savage. Right. We got to think about the connotation of the words that we use, y'all. Savage is not a word we want to use, because that is a word that has often been used to perpetuate atrocities against tribal and indigenous folks, right?
Yeah.
So that's a word that doesn't get used. It automatically gets stricken out of my chat, and then we talk about it. I'm like, okay, you didn't do anything wrong. You're not going to get in trouble, but this is why we don't use that word here.
I think it's important. I think it's important though that you say that, Dr. Blackmon, because I think what the press and media has done with cancel culture It's like one mistake, and it's like the mountain comes on top of that person. Whereas what you're saying is the one mistake, okay, let's take a step back, let's talk about it. I think that's important for people to realize, is that you don't have to be perfect, but you also need to be able to listen and hear when people say those things. Because and I think what Hillary is also putting in chat also is, this is a podcast kind of thing. Well, if you haven't listened to Dr. Blackmon's podcast, you really should, because though she does it from the feminist perspective, I think the perspective is much more global. Even though it's coming from the feminist perspective, I think it is worth a listen. We are out of time for our panel today, but I would like to thank all of our panelists here. I'm going to let Chris take us home for lunch. We will be back in about an hour. So Chris, go ahead for that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much to Dr. Samantha Blackmon, Hillary Phan, Kevin Fair, and Dr. Roberto Gallardo.